Hello everybody, and today we're going to be going over a video that Artosis made about the Vanguard units that are going to be in Stormgate. For those of you who don't know, the people who made StarCraft 2 and Warcraft 3 left Blizzard, and they went to found Frost Giant Studios, and they are making a new RTS called Stormgate. I'm sure you have heard of it before if you are on this channel watching this video, or if you are watching this on YouTube, where it will go after this live stream. I want to first say thank you very much, Artosis, for giving me a permission to go ahead and react to this video and to put in the appropriate lens from my own experience. And why would you care about my experience? Well, I am a 9-year, almost a decade-long player and analyst for a browser-based real-time strategy game called LittleWarGame, and because of the time to kill and a couple of other factors inside of the game, LittleWarGame is an interesting lens to apply that may be a bit different from the StarCraft 2, Warcraft 3, and to a lesser extent things like Zero Space that you may be familiar with. So I want to bring that analysis forward into this. For those of you, again, who don't know Artosis, if you're one of the 2 people in the entire world who don't know who Artosis is, but you have somehow found this video, go ahead and I'm going to provide a link to the original video in the description, and we're going to go ahead and I'm going to advise you go like, subscribe, send all of the positive interactions and the re-engagement. He's really sending some stuff out here that wasn't publicly known, and that we've kind of been waiting on ever since the DreamHack Atlanta. And for those of you who are missing a bit of context, why are we getting this information now? Well, February 5th to 12th, as part of Steam Next Fest, Stormgate is going to have either an opened closed beta or a temporary open beta. The wording is a little obscure, but essentially a lot of people will be able to play. You'll be able to play 3 versus AI, which is the mode that they're pushing to help players who are new to real-time strategy games and put in that social aspect. You'll also be able to play 1v1, and there will be a tournament with a $10,000 prize pool. So there's a lot of reasons to get interested in Stormgate. And we're going to go ahead and look over the Vanguard units. The format of the video is going to be as follows, or the stream if you're watching live. We're going to watch the video. We're not going to say anything unless there's something that really urgently needs to be said in that exact moment. We're going to let Artosis speak. He's properly identifying and presenting what the units are. And then we're going to go over some of the hidden information that maybe you didn't know as you were watching the video, that only by pausing and clicking and checking over and over and over and over and over, you would have actually seen. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to give a comparison to LittleWarGame and maybe some history as to how a unit like this was buffed or nerfed, or the problems that are presented in the player base, how people used it effectively, and then we'll wrap it all up with what does Vanguard as a faction do, how does it seem to play, what is the strategy that you should probably be going for with Vanguard, again, purely from a unit analysis perspective. We are going to be missing some things such as the cost of the units or the build time of the units, and I want to stress that because this is a beta, or maybe even just recently past alpha, many aspects of this game are bound to change. In fact, I'm sure years from now, someone will be looking at this video that Artosis has put up, and will see, wow, that was hilariously broken. Oh, that's not what they went with at all over here. Oh, it's pretty much the same unit it was back then in 2024. So, without further ado, we're going to let him start by talking about the Scout.
So let's start off first with the Scout, since you start with one in every single game as Vanguard. The Scout is actually very similar to Scout Cavalry from Age of Empires 2. Well, you start with it. It's very fast. It's great for scouting the map out. It can do some light harassment, but doesn't really beat anything by itself. It's great for picking up small bonuses around the map. It's extremely fast. It's, you can do a little bit of harassment of like bobs and imps and stuff like that. And it's very cheap and builds quickly, so you can actually mass it quite easily indeed. Also, similar to the Scout Cavalry, you can upgrade it through the game and actually make it a little bit stronger for those later portions of the game if you want to continue to use Scouts. So the Scout definitely has some very specific roles, a very fast unit, a very fun unit, and one I think that we're going to be seeing a lot of.
Okay, so before we go on to the next unit, I want to talk about a bit about the Scout, some things that he didn't explicitly mention, and some context for those of you who maybe weren't watching DreamHack Atlanta or some of the other public-facing videos about Stormgate. So, first thing is that we can notice that the Scout is a biological, light, and mechanical unit. Light in Blizzard RTSs tends to mean you either take a huge amount of damage from AoE. It's not mitigated in any way. And also notice that because it is a biological and mechanical unit, we're going to see two running sub-themes throughout the Vanguard faction. There's going to be biological, which is healthy skin bones units, and then there's mechanical, which are units that they're mechanical. They can be repaired. Notice that the Scout, as a biological and mechanical unit, is actually receiving the benefits of both of those factions. We're going to see that the Medtech has certain effects on biological units, and that that a flying support craft later, the Sentinel, is going to have impacts on mechanical units. Because the Scout gets the benefits of both, this looks like a very transpositional unit. If you're not familiar with chess, transposition is the idea that you can take one opening and you can put in moves in a certain order that will not go by theory into this certain setup of pieces, moves, and positions, but it nevertheless gets there. One way of thinking about that is, if we're fighting and I do a 1-2 punch, and then you dodge and you get a hook like underneath towards my jaw, whether you did that by getting doing a like slipping the 1-2 and then getting under into my jaw, or you just opened with getting in under my jaw, regardless of how we started, we're in the position where there's a fist rocketing towards my jaw, right? And so I think that the Scout is actually going to have a lot of unimplied value, because where do you go? Do you start, if you start with a lot of Scouts, do you go biologically or do you go mechanically? And it looks like it supports both because of the unit types. I also want to notice that when we saw it in DreamHack Atlanta, we actually saw some other streamers who are part of the Stormgate beta mention that they thought that that was the fastest unit, and that only seemingly as of that patch or very recently could Fiends or other enemy units actually outpaced the Scout. We also saw that the Scout, when it dealt damage, looks like it was applying an attack speed and movement speed debuff to struck units. That wasn't emphasized here by Artosis, so it begs the question as to whether or not that ability has been removed. He has mentioned numerous times the passive abilities of later in this video of things such as Lancers and Exos, so it leads us to wonder whether or not that has actually been removed entirely. I want to note that at 120, keep the 120 hit points idea in mind. And another thing that wasn't quite talked about is that in the promotional videos where the Scout was first introduced, we saw that it had an ability that could extend its sight range. And if we looked in the bottom left-hand side of the command card as the Scout was being manipulated, we see that it still had this Z ability, and it looks like an activated ability. Because if it's not an activated ability, why does it have a hotkey associated with it? It would, in Blizzard fashion, as a passive, not have any button associated with it at all. It would just be, oh, you can highlight this and then see what this thing does. So there is some implication there that as of this build, which interestingly is a PTR named Bisu, which is hilarious. Good job. D.3 Delta.39263. Shipping PTR number 4324, which we can see in the upper left hand side of the video. Go ahead and check it out, and when we start into the next unit, you'll be able to see it. Another final thing is I want to talk about how the Scout works in terms of what we've tried in LittleWarGame, another RTS, with having a starting unit. So in the LWG mod created by Invincible, you would start with two wolves, which were functionally Scouts. Very fast, not particularly lethal units that you would use for scouting, but both players would start with them. And what we discovered is that in that mod, or in Dragon Archer Z's BRZK or Berserk mod, the starting units aren't supposed to be able to kill or vastly out micro your opponent, but you can. And what this means is that this kind of implies the maps have a minimum size for the Scout. Because if the maps are too small, then maybe too much harassment can do, and maybe it constricts builds a little too much. What we saw in LittleWarGame with having starting units is that you could snowball your opponent very hard by getting an initial kill with the starting unit. And I want to see if that same thing actually happens with the Scout. The Scout also can, it's Scout. What's weird about starting units is that having a starting unit strongly implies that you think that that faction, either the maps are dynamic, they're not static, so you need the Scout in order to look around and see what's going on. This was done, as was mentioned, in Age of Empires 2, but it was also done in Tooth and Tail, where the premise of that game was that the maps would change around every time that you got into it, and so scouting to see what was on the map was an extremely important and relevant thing for you to do. But the second implication is that if this is for if this is for a faction in a game where there are not dynamic spawns and there are not dynamic creeps, two big and contentious ifs, right? But if that's the case, then that implies that there's a little too much that the other races or factions can do. And Vanguard doesn't actually have the units to otherwise go scout. This strongly implies that they would rather give you a starting scout than force you into a build where you make a starting scout. This might give us a hint into the early metagame development of Stormgate, wherein Vanguard players were probably just making scouts all the time because they need the ability to see things, and they were otherwise being overly restricted in making any other build paths. So, something to think about as it applies to Vanguard going forward. Let's go on.
Moving on next, we have the Lancer. The
Yes.
Lancer is kind of a cross between the Firebat and the Zealot. It's pretty beefy frontline melee unit, but it has an area of effect damage in a straight line.
This is one of those rare times I am going to pause. We're going to come back to the Medtech as a unit. I just want to notice a couple of things here. These are 5 enemy Lancers attacking 1 Lancer that is supported by 1 Medtech. Now, we don't know what the comparative mastery level is of the training of this Medtech, but notice that the hit points of this Exo, not of the Exo rather, the hit points of this unit over here, the Lancer, don't seem to be rapidly decreasing with 5 of them. It seems to have even stabilized, maybe even be going a little bit positive with 4 of them and 1 Medtech. So that gives you a comparative idea as how strong the Medtech is. But Artosis is talking about the Lancer, so let's go.
Not a big wide cone like the Firebat has. So it's especially good at dealing with masses of other melee units, right? If there's like multiple melee units in front of it, it's going to deal extra damage to those, which is very, very helpful. Now, the Lancer has an upgrade called the Kinetic Redirection. This makes it so that whenever the Lancer is hit, it increases its attack and movement speed by 5% for 5 seconds, and that's up to a grand total of 50%. So if it's hit 10 times within those 5 seconds, you're going to have all of that boost together. Now, this makes the Lancer somewhat opposite of the StarCraft 2 Zealot. The StarCraft 2 Zealot, with a charge upgrade, will speed up while it's attacking. The Lancer will speed up while it's being attacked. This upgrade makes the Lancers very mobile and strong units during the heat of a battle. And it can be used similarly to StarCraft 1 Zealots with the speed upgrade as far as maneuverability goes.
Okay, so as he warps into another unit, we're going to go ahead and talk about the Lancer. So some things that you may not have noticed, the hit point bars in Stormgate seem to be an indicator of 50 hit points per. And so when we saw that the Lancer had 5 bars of health, we can assume that it has between 200 and 250 hit points. This is about twice as much as the Scout. We also, if you pause and look repeatedly, you can see the example of the Exo that is in the middle that is taking damage. We can see that the Exo is taking 10 damage, a clean 10 damage from the AoE of that line hit. So a couple of things I want to talk about here. Just the first thing we want to talk about is the Lancer's AoE. It looks like from elsewhere in the video, if we pause and look, it looks like the Lancer does about 14 damage to Bobs per hit. Bobs also being light units, and the Exo is also a light unit, so we have some reasonable indication about the damage that this Lancer does. It does about 14 damage, and the cleave seems to be at about 70% of what the cleave, of what the normal attack deals. But there is something to think about here, which is that there are creeps in this game. There are resource camps, vision camps, things of that nature. And any unit that has baseline AoE, especially if it seems to be 70% damage, at least to the light units or small-sized units, we're not quite sure on damage types yet for Stormgate. That looks like it's going to be extremely powerful when it comes to attacking enemies in Creepland, in PvE. And this is kind of further compounded by kinetic redirection. So If your enemy is attacking you, right? I wanna give you an idea. If you have two lines of lancers and they're like this, the first person who attacks without wiping the opponent loses as long as kinetic redirection is available. If you attack your opponent and they take some damage and their forces are not overwhelmingly outmatched by yours, first off, if they are, they can run away faster. Secondly, if they are matching you, God help you if they're even. You've just made this side much faster. Even 2 hits per frontline Lancer is 5 seconds of plus 10% movement speed. They'll run you down. They'll be able to attack you. Now, what's interesting is that this strongly implies that the line of battle for Lancers is unlike anything that we've seen in most RTS games. And certainly most RTS games that I've played, because whoever attacks first cedes the opportunity to the opponent for that opponent to retreat and that opponent to go ahead and surround you if you attack them often enough. So I think that battles between Lancers are actually going to be defined not by the Lancers themselves, but by the supporting cast units, unless you bring an overwhelming number of forces to bear. But that's going to be difficult as well, because we're going to look at Bob Overcharge shortly later on in this video. So what's interesting is that in PvP, for battling an opponent, especially another Vanguard opponent, I think the battles are going to look like this. You don't want to be the first person to actually hit, but you want them to come into your concave. If you can get them to come into your concave, you'll take the initial couple of hits, because if you get the full surround on your opponent, then they can't run away. This is bonus movement speed. It doesn't make the Lancers fly. So if you deal enough damage, like if you're an inferior force attacking a superior force of Lancers, and you damage them 3 times, they have plus 15% movement speed for 5 seconds. A skillful player, maybe even just a competent player, will be able to surround your Lancers, and then it doesn't matter if your Lancers have plus 50% movement speed, because it's taxed up to 10 times. For 5% for 5 seconds stacks 10 times. Now we don't know if the 5 seconds stacks 10 times. I doubt that. Or if just the percentage stacks, but each modifier decreases and decrepits after the 5 seconds, which seems far more likely. So, but that's PvP Lancers versus Lancers. Lancers with AoE are going to be kind of sick with creeps, just because of the AoE damage that they're going to do. One of the things, too, I want to notice about the Lancer is that its range isn't physically as close as possible melee. Their range is not this, where they hit and hit, right? Their range is more like this. It looks like it's, in LittleWarGame terms, a range of 1 to 2. So it looks like what you actually want to do with the Lancer is get your Lancer as physically close to the enemy target as possible, so you can hit the enemies that are behind it, the wrist on this arm. But what we see in the video is the Lancer standing at this distance in this kind of no man's land space in the center, where there is AoE being exchanged, but there are no units in there. Because of the way that PvE creeping is going to work, this also kind of implies that most enemies are ranged PvE creeps, because if the enemies are melee and you attack with, here's you're attacking with the Lancer. Well, the enemies are going to surround on this side. It's going to be very difficult for that seemingly 70% AoE line, and it looks like a very thin line, to actually manifest in bonus damage for you if the melee enemies surround you. But if you can block them in a certain way, if you can funnel, let's say that you have 2 units here and the Lancer here. Well, we'll do this unit, and then Lancer. Notice this triangle that you've just made? That's going to make the line out funnel enemies into the line, which makes the AoE even more effective. So I wonder if there are creep setups that'll be manifested as a result of the seemingly inherent AoE that the Lancer has. Also notice that because of its kinetic redirection, if you're creeping, if all of the creeps follow the same logic, right? When attacked, they re-attack. When you get too far away, they have a leash range and they get pulled back. These are some things we can kind of intuit from the DreamHack Atlanta games. That really strongly implies that Lancers are actually sick at creeping. One, in their AoE, and two, if you get the kinetic redirection ability, they have 5 seconds to run back to base at bonus 50% movement speed, run to the next creep. In fact, we've done some mods in LittleWarGame where we've had creeps that you could actively recruit to your army. And think of it like the catapult, but what if you could recruit like a crystal that has a group of units inside of it? And we found actually that that just made creeping like one of the best things ever. So I wonder if the unit of the Lancer has actually de-emphasized the power of creeping inside of Stormgate. I also want to note that we've had a unit like this that had some small amount of AoE that you had to reposition. And when you had to reposition that unit for its small amount of AoE, it actually ended up being very, very good against buildings, right? Because you would reposition the unit such that there's a building and a building and a building, and your unit would be here, and you would attack both of them at the same time. And dealing damage to both of them at the same time was kind of an amazingly good thing to do. And with kinetic redirection, this unit can actually run away very quickly. So I don't actually think that it's. I think it's going to be very good at attacking buildings and creeping, right? Especially with kinetic redirection, you just have to be cleanly surrounded in order for the Lancer seemingly to die. But I don't know many units that are plus 50% movement speed and then still faster. Also, the Lancer creates these interesting dynamics where you probably don't want to focus fire the Lancer, right? Unless you're sure it's going to kill it because of its ability to then definitely run away. So that's very interesting. Like in Little War Game, we have archers versus wolves. You can think of wolves. Um, wolves are kind of more like scouts, but with the bonus movement speed, you can think of wolves more like, how to say. You can think that a unit is more like a wolf if the bonus movement speed gets applied to the lancer, and we already see some stutter stepping and staggering of archers to make sure that they go kill fleeing wolves. But if those units got faster, the more that they are getting attacked, short of dying, then this also feeds into the Vanguard sub theme of getting experience, right? So this looks like a prime experience or valor or upgrade or promotion unit, right? AoE, good at PvE, kinetic redirection allows it to run away. Probably not good at attacking enemy workers because workers can surround it also. It seems to do 14 damage with 10 damage AoE on a unit that, I mean, I wouldn't want to walk into Bob Overcharge. We're going to see that later in the video. It's kind of crazy. But we've talked enough about the Lancer. Let's go on to the next one.
Up next, we have the Exo. The Exo is very similar to Marines from StarCraft 1 or 2. It has a ranged attack that hits ground and air, and obviously is a very versatile addition to your army.
Okay.
The Exo has an upgrade called Quick Draw Hustle. This upgrade activates after the Exo attacks something, increasing 25% movement speed for 2 seconds. It allows for heavy micro, similar to using the stim upgrade like in StarCraft 1 or StarCraft 2.
Sure.
There are some key differences from the stim upgrade, though. The Exo doesn't get an attack speed bonus, and it doesn't lose health. It also must keep attacking to maintain that movement speed bonus. So while stim is normally a yes or no decision, Quick Draw Hustle has more to do with player execution in a given scenario.
Okay, so before we go on to the next one, first off, I want to mention that Quick Draw Hustle specifically is going to be a, if it exists in the form that it is mentioned and it is being directly compared to Stim, this is an ability that you are going to get all the time that you are using Exos. If you are using Exos, you're not going to go ahead and get a plus 25% for 2 seconds movement speed buff after firing. I want to note that the upgrade for Quick Draw Hustle has parallels that we can math out to the Lancer. The Lancer as a not quite melee, more like range 1-ish, 1.5-ish, using LittleWarGame's terms unit. That unit, the Lancer would have to take, it only gets 5% movement speed for 5 seconds per hit. In order to get the 25% movement speed, the Lancer would have to take 5 hits, and it has 200 to 250 hit points. We have clicked on an Exo earlier, and we've seen that the Exo has 150 hit points. So notice that the Exo can get the benefit of the Lancer getting hit 5 times just by auto attacking. So if we have this ability, it's going to go ahead and get picked up. Like if you have Exos and that's a part of your army, you're going to go ahead and pick these up. For nothing else, then they look like they seem to be the anti-air in addition, the anti-air unit for the Vanguard faction from the biological side. So I want to notice that the responsiveness of those units and the way that they balled up wasn't quite StarCraft 2 Marine like, right? It was far more, frankly, little wargame archer like. Now, I want to talk a bit about the movement speed aspect because we've actually had speed upgrades inside of Little Wargame, and for a while, speed was a popular niche, if that makes sense, right? An interesting second choice of what upgrade to get, because in Little Wargame, if you're upgrading attack or defense, or at that time range, you weren't upgrading speed, right? So speed actually was not something that we saw on a lot of archers. Archers tended to get damage and they tended to get range, so much so that in fact in the current version of the game, the range upgrade has been removed as something you can stack in the forge and made a separate ability, a separate upgrade on the armory. And the attack upgrade is still in the game and people still use that, right? So range was far more popular. The reason is that they kind of share similarities to the Exo seems to share similarities to the Archer in that they look like they're decently fast, but slower than the other units we've seen. Like the Lancer looks like it's about the same speed. The Scout definitely looks like it's a faster unit. Um, so they have they have good micro potential, and yes, every time they hit, they get that 25% movement speed. This again goes into my mind in creeping because 25% movement speed is good, but 2 seconds is an incredibly short duration, and that means that actually you're gonna see Exos do like Marine Baneling split micro. I don't think you're gonna see them like hedgehogs, which we'll get into later, where they fire, run, fire, run. I don't think we're going to see that quite as much because an ability that gives 25% movement speed means that you start having movement creep or speed creep. And the best way to take care of speed creep is to have stuns and slows. We saw from the game that there's a possibility of a unit like the Magmadon still having its charge slow. We're going to get the Vulcan later, which does have a like quick burst of speed and then stuns whatever it hits for seemingly 3 to 4 seconds. I don't think Exos deal particularly well. One in AoE because of the way that you're going to control them. You're going to want to have them grouped together instead of little siloed pockets. It's just going to be easier to control them that way. So it looks like they're going to eat because they have 150 health massively from AoE, and they're going to be really negatively impacted by speed control of any form. And really, I think that the quick draw hustle isn't for the army engagement. I don't think that that's the strongest way. Now, there's probably, similar to how there are timings with Stim, or there were in Little Wargame, timings with the range upgrade and +1 attack. There's probably timings where running a bunch of Exos into your opponent, quick draw, hustle, bam, 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 like, run them down. They don't have a fast enough unit. Just win from pure speed, like, do a Wolf Glick from Pokemon, except in an RTS game, and just wreck your opponent with superior unit speed. That seems like it could have some possibilities. But actually, again, creeping. If every time you fire a shot you get plus 25% movement speed, this has another implication for creep, which is that there's probably a lot of ranged creeps, actually. Now, I know for the Lancer I said that there's probably melee creeps, but melee is easier to deal with as a leash range, and then a ranged I mean, for those who don't know, leash range is the distance in a game like Warcraft 3 where sorry. Leash range is the range after which that unit from the camp, the neutral camp, the creep, stops attacking you, stops chasing you, and then runs back. This helps prevent you doing things like bringing all of the creeps over to your opponent's base and having them attack your opponent for you as extra army forces. It stops you from doing things like bringing the creeps back to your static defenses and killing them that way, right? It stops you from basically abusing the pathing and the AI. So, but if this unit gets bonus movement speed every time that it attacks, then this has strong implications for the speed that creeps have. Because if after the quick draw hustle, Exos can kite all of the if creeps are mostly melee, and after quick draw hustle, Vanguard players with Exos can uh, micro back the units and kite them without risk of getting hit by these melee units, then Vanguard are unbelievably good at creeping. They're goated. Like if they can creep without taking damage just for the cost of micro, people are definitely going to do that. Especially since we're not in 2000 anymore. RTS is not an extremely popular genre, but people have gotten familiar. I mean, even from a MOBA perspective or from in a battle arena, like a battle right style game perspective, they've gotten used to the idea of run back, click this unit, attack this, run back, attack, click. You know, they've gotten used to that. It's far more common. It's something that lower level players, even players that you would say are only reaching competency now, have some familiarity with. So this leads me to think that creeps are actually kind of overwhelmingly ranged. Not least because if creeps are all melee, it's kind of weird if they're a melee creep that then how do you have any protection against air, right? So I think that most creeps are probably most creeps it is strongly implied by this that most creeps are going to be ranged, and if most creeps are melee, that they're going to be fast. And if you find on a map that creeps are melee and are not fast enough to deal with post quick draw hustle exos, then either quick draw hustle is very high up on the tech tree, in which case this isn't a problem, or it's not, and exos are just kind of insane, right? One of the things about archers in LittleWarGame, the unit comparison to the exo, is that you do want 20 of them, but you don't want to have 8 of them or 9 of them. Do you get what I'm saying? The process of building up to have them feels very bad, but once you have them, it feels very good. One of the reasons that's the case in LittleWarGame is that you have 11 archers. Sound. How do you move them across the map? How do you know where your opponent's army is? How do you know that you won't just get ganked? How do you know that you just won't get surrounded and your whole army crushed and then the game is over? And so archers tend to be a more passive and defensive unit. But in this game, there are creeps, and if we add in quick draw hustle, it's possible that you can attack and creep and then run the units away, and then it's actually risky for your opponents to be that far out on the map figuring out what you're doing. So I think that the Exo is like the Archer from LittleWarGame, but because of creeps, being the Archer from LittleWarGame is a mad positive. It's so good. On to the next one.
Dive in to the Super
Are you
Mario
serious?
Bros.
I have no desire. No, skip, 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 skip. Cease, desist. I don't want this.
Then we have the Medtech.
Okay.
The Medtech is similar to StarCraft 1's Medic, but a bit more useful. Firstly, it has its own attack, so it's really never useless in a battle. It also has Adept and Master training. The Adept training increases the Medtech's energy restoration and unlocks Nano Swarm.
Before we continue, I want you to note that in that one where they were showing off the Lancer that had the ability to do a thin line of AoE, and it was fighting 5 other Lancers, and they were showing the AoE affecting an Exo in the middle and dealing 10 damage, one Medtech of unknown mastery level was there, and it looks like one Medtech plus one Lancer was actually allowing the Lancer to tank with seemingly no change in hit points to tank 4 Lancer attacks at the same time. And so I would if this is a bulky medic, as its unit design kind of implies, then if it's bulky, we might see what Artosis does himself when he's playing against Zerg for Brood War, where you put the medic, or in this case the medtech, in front of the Lancers or in front of your other units so that it can tank. But I think that's part of the reason that the medtech has an ability to attack is that the fact that medics can't attack is actually a boon in terms of their positioning in Brood War from the games that I've seen. So the fact that this unit can attack means there's an equal chance, as long as the attack priority isn't deliberately different between it and other combat units, for it to be attacked. So that leads me to suspect that medtechs with these bonus masteries are very, very powerful when they're put behind the way that you would traditionally think that a medic should be behind the front lines.
Nano Swarm casts a healing aura on a friendly.
I want to note a couple of things. Again, I haven't been pausing this section by section of the video. We've been waiting for Artosis to speak and then getting through all of it. But there are some things that are going on here that it's easier to just show visually. This Nano Swarm that was cast on this scout, first off, remember scouts are mechanical and biological. So they'll get the benefit of the medtechs, and they'll also get the benefit of the support flying craft that we're going to see later on that benefits mechanical units. So Scout seems very good because of this ability to fit 2 roles, right? It's like It's like a good piece of sideboard tech in constructed Magic the Gathering, right? Also note the Nano Swarm is in an area right here. I want to note this little minor healing aura right here that's happening. So note this scout is going
Mechanical
around
unit.
and it's healing, but we do see passive healing happening onto this one. So it looks like what the Nano Swarm actually does in Little Wargame terms is it casts an aura on a target unit, and then that target unit casts a modifier that increases the hit points of all biological, it looks like, units that surround it. If this heals mechanical units, it's insanely strong.
Or a lighter area of effect damage aura on an enemy mechanical unit. The Master Training unlocks System Shock, which will remove positive buffs from enemy units or remove debuffs while increasing movement speed a bit for friendly units. You can kind of think of it as a better version of the StarCraft 1 Medic's restoration ability.
Okay, so before we warp into the next one, I do want to talk a bit about the Medtech because there's a lot going on here. So first off, notice that it has an attack, which means that its attack priority should be equivalent or similar to the other units that you're fighting on the game. And that means that if we think about this in Team Fortress 2 terms, kill the medic first. The rate of its healing seems very good. I want to notice that there is actually an unstated design implication here. So in StarCraft 2 and in other Blizzard RTSs, we have had, you can research, this amulet or this ability that gives you bonus mana. Okay? That's a pretty common upgrade. Go back and think about some of the spellcasters in Brood War and Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2. It's pretty common for the amount of mana that you have to be increased. And this functionally is important. This is important because it changes how bursty that unit, in StarCraft 2 terms, it changes how bursty that unit could be, right? Think about High Templar getting an energy upgrade. So they can go from casting 2 Psionic Storms to casting 3 of them, right? Things like this. Increasing the amount of mana that a unit has as an ability means that you have more immediate ability to apply all of those. So you stack up more of the ability, and then, if necessary, you can use the abilities multiple times throughout. Notice that they stressed multiple times, Artosis did actually, and Stormgate itself seems to, that the Adept training and the Master training, they don't actually give you more mana. They give you more mana restoration. And I want to notice that both Nano Swarm and System Shock looks like they took about 50% of the Medtech's mana. So there's a functional difference here. If we were doubling or increasing the amount of energy, right, then the Medtech would be able to cast more Nano Swarms at once, more System Shocks at once. But because it's increasing its mana regeneration, that means, and we've seen there that both of those abilities take about 50% of the mana of the Medtech, right, at an unknown level of mastery. This strongly implies that the Medtech is balanced and deliberately made so that it can only cast 2 Nano Swarms or 2 System Shocks or a Nano Swarm and a System Shock. Now, you might be able to leverage your APM to cast it more consistently than your opponent because mana regeneration rate is filling means you're getting more mana faster. You can fill it up, you can use the ability. There's more of a skill tax there, making sure that you are paying attention to the fight, paying attention to your abilities and when to use it, right? But they're deliberately choosing not to make it so that you can just spam the ability multiple times, right? It looks like this is done deliberately to prevent things like, oh, well, I have the energy for 4 Nano Swarms, so doot, all of these things have Nano Swarm and they're healing, and it's great. So I want to notice a couple of things too. I didn't play a lot of Warcraft 3, so this will be a brief point. But having played Warcraft 3, The Frozen Throne campaign, and just enough editor games and online games to get completely destroyed, it looks like System Shock is like the Spellbreakers, right? That Kalthus, I think his name is. Kalthus? Has access to. Now, they're a little bit different. They transfer positive buffs from allies to yourself and transfer negative buffs from your allies to enemies. These simply remove them, right? If your ally has a positive buff, remove it. If your enemy has a positive buff, remove it. Like if you have a debuff, remove it. If your enemy has a good positive buff, remove it. And yet again, we see this sub-theme of Vanguard units getting faster and having mobility because it adds some minor MS. It adds some minor movement speed. So I do want to note as we're going through this, pay attention to what the abilities are that you would want to remove. So far, the biggest ability that we've seen that you would want to remove is, I have a question. Does this work on buildings? Can you remove the overcharge ability from the command post? If this only works on units, it could probably remove the Nano Swarm that we just saw that the Medtech casts. That kind of makes sense to me. But can it remove some of the support abilities of the spellcasters that we're going to see later? Does it remove, when we talk about removing buffs? Does it, when, like, could you miss target and remove the debuff from an opponent? Will you be prevented from targeting an opponent that doesn't have a debuff with system shock? Is there an auto cast? That's something that spellbreakers have in Warcraft 3, is the ability to auto cast that ability. Now notice that that ability doesn't take 50% of the spellbreaker's mana, whereas it does here for the Medtech. So this kind of implies that that isn't the case. And in fact, Stormgate seems to be going out of its way to make sure that you have to focus on the battle. All of these Vanguard things with increasing movement speed is a great thing to give a player for skill differentiation, because you have to pay attention to your units and use them in the battle for it to actually matter. If I'm like not even bronze, if I'm compost 10, I'm like the bottom of the skill differentiation. My bracket, garbage, right? If I'm compost 10 and my unit has plus 50% movement speed, but I'm not paying attention to the battle and I don't damage it at all, then guess what? I get no benefit from it having bonus movement speed. But I would get a benefit from it having the passive ability to add buffs or remove buffs, the passive ability to gain more damage as it's getting attacked, things of that nature. So just want to notice that medtechs look like they're supposed to be targetable. They look like they're not supposed to mess up pathing. Um, they look like they're a good support unit, but it also looked like it was doing a pittance in terms of damage, right? And so MedTech just looks like a supportive unit. Now, I do want to mention some comparisons to LittleWarGame. We have the Priest in LittleWarGame, and I want to tell you that the Priest is one of the most nerfed units that the game has ever had, because the Priest has an ability, this will sound very similar to Nano Swarm, the